Let's get started. My name is Craig Benson. Glad to be here today. I'm the moderator. Through EREF, we've been offering science sessions periodically on topics of interest to the broader community that are meant to present where research is going, where findings are going, and how they potentially may impact our broader community. We're lucky today to hear a really interesting presentation from Mike Wong. Mike is a professor and department chair for chemical and biomolecular engineering at Rice University. And we'll have just a little bit more about Mike and his background a little bit later. But we're going to learn today about some really interesting techniques to destroy a forever compound. Next slide, please. Hit next for me, Mike. Just a few housekeeping issues. First, everybody that's on board, please just keep yourself muted. We're going to ask questions throughout the presentations. These are meant to be interactive in a dialogue, but we don't really have a convenient way for people to just jump in and ask a question directly and verbally. So enter them through the question control panel. You'll see that in the GoToWebinar control panel. There's a special section for questions. Just enter them there. As they come through, I'll be looking at them. And periodically, I'm going to stop Mike and share those questions with him. I usually tell the speaker who's asking the questions so that he knows where it's coming from and can tailor it to that from that perspective. And if you'd like me not to do that, just let me know when you put in the question. Most people are fine with that, but I just want to give the option if you're uncomfortable being identified. The slides will be available. They are available for download. You go to the handout section on the control panel. It's near the bottom. You just open that section up and download from there. And finally, when we're done with this, you'll receive a certificate of completion for PDHs in a follow-up email the following Monday. So next Monday, you'll get that. And many of us need those PDH certificates for our professional credentials. I use them for my PE license renewal every 2 years. Next slide, please, Mike. Just a little bit about EREF before we get started. I know many of you know a good bit about EREF, but I think for those of you who aren't as intimately involved, I just want to share a little bit about what EREF does. I've been involved with EREF, the Environmental Research and Education Foundation. EREF is our abbreviation for that. But I've been involved with EREF for about a decade. And I've really found this to be an interesting organization of academics, government, industry folks, all associated with a mission around sustainable solid waste management and driving a circular economy. EREF participates in this in many different ways. One is through research grants. Academics and others submit research proposals on themes around that sustainable solid waste management topic, and they're reviewed, and some of those are funded each year. They tend to be very application oriented, so the results of those projects actually get out into the real world. Very practical projects. Education. EREF is actively supporting education, creating educational tools, and also participating in creating scholarships. Some of my own graduate students have had scholarships for master's and doctoral programs in the area. The scholarships really are a wonderful opportunity for students. And then finally, data and policy reports and statements that EREF develops, gathering information, synthesizing it, and then putting that information out in a report, in a webinar, in a science session like this, sharing that for the broader community, really driven around providing information that helps us create change. Can I have the next slide, Mike? Just a little bit about our science sessions. These are about an hour long. We will end directly on the hour, so we won't run over. I know other people have commitments, so we'll be careful about that. will run for 1 hour and be done on the top of the hour. They are about current research findings, as I mentioned earlier. So this is really about where things are going. But this isn't a lecture. This isn't a formal webinar where you're just listening and then perhaps asking a few questions at the end. We want it to be interactive. So please do use that question box. Put your questions in, and every so often, as indicated, I will stop Mike and ask him those questions. And we may combine some questions, and some may naturally come up by looking at what comes in through the chat box. So I will try to get, through the question box. I will get to everyone's questions, but in some cases I may blend them together. I think we already covered the PDH part. All right, so let's go one more slide. Our sponsors make this happen. This is a list of sponsors for today. I can't thank them enough. These activities that we all participate in for very low cost are available because these sponsors think it's important. And we're very grateful for what they've provided to help us make this happen today. Next slide. Before we get into Mike's talk, just a note that we do have another science session on PFAS coming up in early December. It's going to be in December 9th, same time. That's a Thursday, always doing these on a Thursday. I won't be moderating this time. Brian Staley, who's the president and CEO of EREF, will be the moderator for that session. And we have a couple of really interesting speakers talking about treating PFAS using AC and DC. So that should be interesting as well. Lots of different discussion about PFAS in these science sessions. And our next slide. Yeah, now what we're here to learn about and to hear from, not me, but to hear from Mike. Just a little bit about Mike. As I mentioned, he's professor and department chair in chemical and biomolecular engineering at Rice University. He also holds the Patel Chair in molecular nanotechnology. For those of you who are not in the academic world, holding an endowed chair recognizes the best faculty that a university has, and Mike has had that honor bestowed on him. So we're lucky to have such a qualified individual here today. He's done lots of different research work and participating in a number of different collaborative teams. One of the things that I've noticed about Mike is he works very much across traditional boundaries, and that's where a lot of the really interesting problems get solved today. And so I think we're going to hear about that as we go forward. And the next slide is going to be Mike, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Craig, for that really wonderful and generous opening remarks. And a good morning and a good afternoon to everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and I thank EREF for the opportunity to share what's been going on in my laboratory at Rice University. I have a few slides, but what I like to do is to talk about why I love and hate PFAS. So I love PFAS for all the things that it does do for us as a material. And it's been, I don't have to say much to this audience about how important PFAS is as a working material in all sorts of consumer products. But I hate PFAS. It's everywhere. It's we don't know what to do with it when we're done with it. When we're done with it, it leaks out and it gets into our water, soil, and our air. It's insidious, and we're learning that it has very deleterious health effects. And that is something where, through my group, I have been trying to work and train my team of students and postdocs and researchers, not just in chemical engineering, but also in the chemistry field, civil and environmental. I have a joint appointment there in the materials departments, to really think about creative ways to destroy and to remove PFAS from our current system here. And so the slides that I do have really will help to show a short story about how we came across this, I would say, an interesting way to break down PFAS. Okay. This, by the way, is a picture of my beautiful campus. When you see pictures of campus, they're usually taken on the most beautiful days. And so here it is, a day last month in October, when we had some nice weather and But if you look at it, not that we've measured it, but if I had to measure and look for PFAS, I would expect to find ppb or ppt levels of PFAS somewhere in this picture here. Okay, so to perhaps address our starting point, I will describe what we do in my group at Rice, which is we try to develop technologies based on materials chemistry to address, I would say, broadly engineering problems. And so the types of engineering problems I'm interested in, and my group has been interested in, has been looking at ways to do chemical transformations. And so chemical transformations, what does that mean? What it really means is, how can I take compound A and to turn it into compound B? And so as a chemical engineer, I want to upgrade compound A into compound B, which can sell a little bit more. That's maybe more useful. For example, petroleum to gasoline, for example. Where my group and what motivates my deep interest in water technologies is to treat this A to B chemical transformation in the following way. I want to figure out ways to break down compound A and not try to upgrade B, but to turn A into B that's safer, non-toxic, and out of the environment. And I've learned over the years that there's a rich area of environmental engineering, water quality engineering, where there is a huge need to treat waters that are contaminated with nuisance compounds, but also dangerous compounds through destructive means. There are current physical displacement means, absolutely, but we want to go a step further in thinking about a circular economy. How can we destroy these compounds from our environment in totality in a cheap way, inexpensive way, easy to implement way? And one of the big conclusions that I had in my group and with my colleagues here at Rice and other universities is to say, catalysis, this very important approach in chemical engineering, can play a meaningful role in helping to manage water quality issues. And so PFAS represents a very exciting example from my group, which I'm happy to share this morning. So let's jump into it a little bit. Let's pretend you're a researcher in my lab and walk through what a typical experiment looks like. And this is something that my team of researchers worked on we started on this maybe about 3 years ago on using lights to destroy contaminants as a way to treat water contaminants. More broadly, we've been working in this space for about 2 decades now. In this case here, this example was one of our first explorations of seeing how a material called TiO2 or titanium can be used to degrade contaminants in general. Okay, and so contaminants include, in our case, chlorinated solvents, organic, non-polar solvents like dioxane, nitrate, nitrites. We've tried many of these things already, and it works. And we thought, PFAS is something that we want to get into. It's out there. Let's figure out if there are some things we can contribute in terms of the science, but also in the technology. And so we got into the lab. When I say we, my students, they came together. We built this light box, and you might see in this picture a bank of UVC light bulbs, 3 on the left-hand side, 3 on the right-hand side. And that's our light source. And in the middle is our stir plate. And on top of that is our glass quartz, not quartz, excuse me. It's not glass, but it's quartz, a flask. And it contains water. It contains PFOA, that's our model compound. And it's cloudy. And it's cloudy because we threw in a little bit of TiO2 P25 powder. And we don't fill it all the way to the top. We fill it halfway, and in that headspace is air. Okay? And then we cap it up with a rubber septum, close up the lid, and then we turn on the light. Okay? And so we ran this experiment, and what we found was that yes, in our lab we can show that TiO2 plus UVC light plus air is our oxidant, can degrade PFOA but slowly. Okay? And I'll show you one more slide here to kind of walk you through how we look at our data. And on the y-axis is our PFOA concentration in micromolar. That's the equivalent of about 50 ppm starting. The second y-axis is fluoride concentration. I'll talk more about that in a sec. And then the x-axis is time. So that blue curve goes from 50 ppm, and you can see that over the course of 6 hours or so, that the PFOA concentration drops, which is what we expect. The TiO2 does photocatalytically degrade PFOA. The concentration of PFOA drops, which is a good sign, but it's not the only sign we need to show true degradation. PFOA concentration can also decrease through simple adsorption on the surface of TiO2 or on carbon, for example. We don't have carbon here, so we have to account for that. So we conclude that we do have degradation by measuring the fluoride ion concentrations. Now, we have different methods in the lab. We've tried ion selective electrode measurements. Those turns out to be not very, they're fine, but more on a qualitative basis, at least in our hands. And so we use ion chromatography to really pin down the exact ion concentration of fluoride. And then we can see that the fluoride ion concentrations go from 0 to, in this case here, about 65% of all the total fluorines that's in the system is in the form of fluoride ions. And so that's the direct evidence that the carbon-fluorine bond is breaking. Okay? So any new technologies, especially based on destructive technologies, you want to make sure that the PFAS concentration lowers and then the fluoride ion concentration goes up. Okay? So I'll make one more point here about the TiO2 system, is that yes, it works. People published on this already. It is active, but it's slow. And in this case here, in my eyes, it's, it's okay. And it's about 2.5 hours of a half-life. So half-life is a good number for us to keep track of. PFOA in the natural environment would have reported values of about on the order of decades or even centuries, depending on who's made those measurements. But it takes, if it takes decades to remove PFOA naturally through natural degradation mechanisms, that's a little too long. That's part of the reason why PFAS are called forever chemicals. So in our system, in our little quartz reactor, the half-life of PFOA is 2.5 hours, which is substantially shorter than the decades long half-life in the environment. But 2.5 hours is a little too long for a practical application. So in the work that we started to do from a couple of years ago, we thought, can we develop a better material beyond TiO2 that can help shorten up the half-life of PFOA? And if so, can this chemistry also work on other types of PFAS compounds with different molecular structures? Okay.
Hey, Mike, your graph here really shows the photocatalytic part, right? Because I think your dashed line at the top is the same experiments with the light off, correct?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, so without the light, it really doesn't do anything. Can you just tell the audience a little bit about kind of what is that photocatalytic process doing relative to just the TiO2 mixed with the PFOA in solution?
No, that's a very important question to ask is, how is this working, right? What's the chemistry behind it? And so from a practical standpoint, we need 3 ingredients. You need the catalyst, which is the TiO2. You need the energy source, which is, in our case, the UVC light 254. And then you need the oxidant. In our case, it's air. In papers that you might read, it could be H2O2, it could be peracetic acid. But in our case, air is good because it's, quote unquote, free. UVC light is free in the sense that it is coming from a light bulb, not exactly free. And TiO2 is a common material. So what's happening? What's the basis for this chemistry? And so what I'll do is I'll show a next slide to kind of walk through, and it's an important way to kind of think about generally the photocatalytic chemistry for PFOA breakdown. Okay? So imagine that little circle is a representation of the TiO2 material. And just imagine the TiO2 as this, it is a white powder, but imagine now that this UVC light coming in, impinging onto the surface, this UVC light at 254 nanometers. Essentially what's happening is that the TiO2 powder is absorbing this light, and when it absorbs this light energy, it creates chemical energy, and that chemical energy creates a hole and an electron pair. Okay, this electron is a chemical species. A hole, we call it a hole, but it's really just it's a vacancy. It's just another easy way to say it's where the electron used to be, but we call it a hole. So this electron now, and then this hole, you might consider that as two separate chemical species. And then now what has to happen is that the electron needs to react with something. In our case here, and generally accepted for TiO2 photocatalysis, is that the E reacts with dioxygen in the air to create hydrogen peroxide. That takes care of what the electron does, but you have to have the hole do something too in order for the TiO2 to continue to absorb light, to convert the light energy into chemical energy. So what's going on with the hole? So the hole basically accepts electrons. And it's, or you might think of it as the hole is going to pull an electron away from, in our case, PFOA. So PFOA has that 7 carbons that's attached to fluorine, and then you have an extra carbon that's part of the carboxylic acid head group. And the mechanism for the breakdown of the PFOA in solution now, and all the things that you see on the, let me pull up my cursor here. Let's see here. There we go. Everything that you see here, it represents chemical reactions that are generally accepted as happening just above the surface of the TiO2, but sitting in water still. And so what's happening is that this PFOA donates an electron to the catalyst surface, and then this catalyst is happy now, and it can then absorb light. But what happens to this fragment? This fragment now is energetically unstable, and then it starts this breakdown of from this guy to this guy, where the step here is that the oxygen is released, and you basically pluck off the carboxylic acid head group. So now you've taken off 1 carbon, and you go from a C8 to a C7. This C7 now reacts as a radical with something else. And in this case here, there's some theories about how it actually happens, but generally it's accepted that this radical reforms to create a new carboxylic acid head group of a C7 length now. And then this guy here can then come back and react and donate another electron to this TiO2 in this sort of a cycle loop here. Every time it cycles through, it releases 1 CO2 and it releases 2 fluoride ions. That's where the fluoride is being released. In this process, this is how the CF bond is breaking as well. You do it enough times, you go from a C8, and eventually we get to complete mineralization of CO2 100%. So that's the mechanism by which the PFOA oxidizes through this use of this TiO2 through photocatalysis. Okay. So that, if we take a step back, this can be applied, to other types of materials, where if this is happening in the water just above the catalyst surface, how can we improve the photocatalyst and make the overall system work a little bit better? So we as engineers, we said, you know what, let's go ahead and think about maybe not so much redesigning the TiO2 material, because it does a pretty good job. It's slow, but it works. But can we come up with another material that does something similar, where it can absorb the UV light, generate these holes and electrons, but somehow be able to do it more efficiently and somehow make this cycling and this shortening of this PFOA even faster? So that's how we got into this whole business of coming up with a new catalyst material for PFOA photooxidation. So, well, I brought this challenge to my team, and we said, all right, let's figure out how to do that. And my students, I tell you what, they work really hard, and we tried all sorts of things. We learned a lot from the literature, and we couldn't get it to work. I mean, the research results were great, but we wanted to just do something different, and we thought we were very clever, and the data just wasn't coming out to be better than the TiO2 P25 results. And we thought, well, what are we missing here? And so as scientists, working in the lab, we said, let's go ahead and, you know, run our control materials. Let's go ahead and use these materials, and let's just break it down again. And one of my team members said, let's go ahead and try out this material called, we tried many things, by the way, and one came up to be something that really worked for us. She said, let's try boron nitride. What is this material, boron nitride? Yes, sir.
Hey, just one question before we dig into the boron nitride. This came from Cedric Mott. Is this reaction possible out of waters? Is this something just in the aqueous phase, or other applications as well?
No, thanks for that question, Cedric. The reaction works in water very well. It also works in the gas phase. The mechanism is similar, but because there's no water to solvate the fluoride ions, what happens in the gas phase is that the fluoride has to go somewhere, but it's going to stay in the gas phase stuck onto the surface of the catalyst. So which means that you can run it in the gas phase, but then the catalyst is going to get saturated pretty quickly with these fluoride ions. So what that means then is that in order for the catalyst to work under air, or under air, is that we have to heat up the reactor from room temperature to something high enough so that the fluoride ions don't stay stuck onto the surface, but can come off as well, I mean, it comes off as HF actually, but if you do it cleverly, maybe it can come off as some sort of gaseous fluoride. Pluses and minuses, but the short answer is that it can operate under air, but at higher temperatures. Hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, that was great. I got one more. Would applying heat possibly speed up the titanium reaction? That's
yes.
Tim Bannister.
Thanks, Tim. So the reaction itself, the starting point is to use light. Why? Because light is somewhat free, or at least you plug it and get the energy from the wall. And we generally keep the temperatures, at least in the water case, at room temperature. We really don't want to heat it up because energy costs money. But from a chemistry perspective, yes, you can heat up the reaction, and the reaction will go faster. And so from an implementation perspective, if you have a source of heat that's perhaps cheap or even free, such as waste heat, then yes, that can actually enhance the activity of this reaction.
Yeah, really good. Thank you.
Sure thing. So as we thought about the types of catalyst materials, to get back to this magic material in our hand. So boron nitride, by the way, it's a very common material. It's not a fancy new material. It's been around for decades. It began its manufacture of hexagonal phase of boron nitride was probably in the 1950s or so. And more recently, people have gotten back into boron nitride because boron nitride actually shows up as two-dimensional nanosheets. You might even call it the white equivalent of graphite. So actually, graphite is black, and boron nitride is white colored. And so people do refer to boron nitride as white graphite. Okay, FYI. So for us, boron nitride was an interesting material in and of itself because of some nano properties, but for PFAS, for photocatalysis, it has no connection to photocatalysis at all. Why? Because it has such a wide band gap. It has a band gap of about 6 eV. The TiO2 has a band gap of about 3 eV. What that means is that TiO2 can absorb UV light, UVC light, and UVA light as well. But boron nitride, it cannot absorb UVA light, and it should not absorb in the UVC range either. but we found that it actually does. Very interesting chemistries. Lots of reasons why we think boron nitride should not have worked, but it does work. Okay, that's kind of a bottom line I wanted to share with everyone. But otherwise, it's a common material used for other types of application. It has really good thermal conductivity, so it's used as a coating, used for high temperature thermal management. It's a two-dimensional flat sheet material, so it's slippery, so it is used as a solid lubricant. And it's a white material, so it's used in cosmetics. So it's out there, and it's safe and non-toxic. So my student said, let's give this a try, run it as a control. That's what my suggestion is. And we found something interesting. We asked the question, really, does this thing degrade PFOA? You kind of know the answer already. I'm kind of leading up to it. Here are the first results. Cleaned up results, I would say. Same type of data that I showed earlier. And I'll walk everyone through a little bit here. The dotted lines represent what happens when we don't introduce light or just use light. Nothing happens. Okay, you need all three ingredients: the material, in this case boron nitride, the UVC light, and air. The same reaction conditions as previously shown. That combination really works to degrade PFOA. You can see the PFOA concentration drop. And we ran this thing for the full 6 hours, but we lost track of the PFOA after 4 hours. It went to non-detect. Non-detect in our case, at least at that time, was 1 ppm. And the half-life went from 2.5 hours to about 1 hour. The fact that it actually worked was surprising to us, number one. Number two, that it worked better than TiO2 under UVC light, that was also a surprise. But we're going to run with it. We're going to roll with it. But as I mentioned earlier, you just don't only look at the PFOA concentration drop. You got to look at the fluoride ion concentration increase. And sure enough, we can see the fluoride ion concentration increase continuously, and we can see it increase even more to this number of 72%, meaning 72% of all the organofluorines introduced into the little reactor has come off and detected as fluoride ions. That made us stop, sit up, and think there's something going on here. Okay. Lots of interesting things that we've been able to build on this simple, I would say, observation, but it really forced us to ask the questions at the scientific level and at the applications level. Okay. I have a few more slides, but I kind of wanted to kind of give everyone a sense of kind of where we're at this point. This is an observation that my team of students figured out and really discovered in the lab. It was really unexpected that the PFOA would degrade in the presence of BN under these conditions here. We figured out why it does work the way it does, by the way, and but based on that, we were able to kind of say, okay, how can we redesign the BN to do this and to do that? Okay. So one of the things that that got us to think a little bit more thoughtfully is why does PFOA work better for in this BN case? And I'm not going to show a slide, but I'll just sort of say it to everyone here, is that what we think makes BN more effective for PFOA than TiO2 is the hydrophobic nature of the boron nitride. Okay. The boron nitride, maybe I'll flip back to the earlier slide, has these physical properties. It's chemically stable. As I mentioned, it's a solid lubricant, high thermal conductivity. And there's two parts of this material that makes it to us very interesting. And number one, I mentioned that it has a wide band gap. It is a semiconductor, and it should not absorb UVC light. But we did the measurements, and we actually found that boron nitride, in the powdered version anyway, does absorb light. And that's a critical conclusion for us, because boron nitride in the pure form without any surface defects will not absorb the UVC light. However, in the powdered version, because you have high surface to area volumes, that the surface does not terminate in only nitrogen, but it needs to terminate with oxygens on the edges there. And so those represents chemical defects. So those chemical defects, we think, is where the action is happening for this photocatalysis to happen. Now, those defects sorry, go ahead.
And Mike, one question that came up is the reactions that you had described, they're still in the aqueous phase, right?
Yes.
Right.
We've tried everything, and yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You can explain that, and I'll ask you another
one. So much to say and so little time, right? We run all these reactions in the water phase, and that's been our standard default for sure. And certainly one of the directions that we're kind of pushing towards is, can this reaction happen in the non-aqueous phase? So can we work under very concentrated conditions where the PFAS would be high concentrations, maybe in an organic solvent? And the answer is maybe. And I think, though, also in another direction is gas phase. Can this work under the gas phase conditions? And I think that the answer is yes. It can work under the gas phase if you can figure out a way of what to do with these fluoride ions that would be generated. So what else is on your mind, Craig?
Another question. This one's from, I'm going to try to pronounce this properly, Haijo Scharf from the Netherlands. It says PFOA was non-detect after 4 hours, but the fluoride's still increasing. So what's going on with the fluoride, and what form is it in where it's still present?
Yeah, excellent eyes. I'll show you that data again, and there is a clear gap here. Non-detect right around here, so we should expect that if we assume PFOA completely defluorinates, we should expect the 100% defluorination right around the 4-hour mark. But there's a gap here from 100%, let's say, to 72%. The answer is the fluoride that is not detected are still attached to shorter chain versions of the PFOA.
Right.
So that's a direct answer.
Yeah, that makes good sense. Hey, a follow on from David. Let me see if I can get David's last name here on got just a little edge of my questions control panel. David Durakovic. What is there a minimum concentration at which this will work for PFOA? Some lower bound below which the reaction won't take place anymore?
Yeah, so we have not identified a lower bound below which it does not work. And that is what I would expect. And for the reason that PFOA, if it finds that surface, it will want to bind to that surface, whether it's one molecule in water or one, ppm of the molecule in water. Now, there might be a practical limit, though. I think that might be a separate question, but theoretically, there is no lower bound to PFOA. If there's PFOA, it will fall apart.
Here's another one that came in from Joan Smith or Smythe. Have you run the experiment long enough to get closer to 100% to really fully degrade it? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. For the publication that we put out there, we stopped after 6 hours. And I asked my students, why couldn't you run it longer? And they said, well, we had to go get dinner and sleep also. So I get that. But the answer to the question is, have we run it longer? The answer is yes. And does the defluorination go up? The answer is yes also. What that means, have we reached 100%? The answer is no. So if we look at this graph here, the 72 does go up beyond the 6-hour mark. And why is that? It's because the shorter chain is also defluorinating, okay? Now, it doesn't reach up to 100% because we haven't run it long enough. And I think that if we run it for, say, let's say hypothetically for 2 weeks, I would expect 100% defluorination. From a practical perspective, that's probably a bit too long under most applications, but to that point, the shorter chain is defluorinating, but defluorinating and releasing the fluoride at a slower pace. Okay.
I got a practical question from Jeffrey Jang. This question was about scaling it up in a treatment system, say for example in a plant, or you've got a greater volume of solution that you're trying to treat, a greater attenuation of light, your ability to direct that light where the reaction is gets more complicated. Is there some maximum volume or other kind of practical limitations that you're thinking about, maybe something you're going to have to work around?
Yes, those are really important questions that we as engineers are thinking through and really trying to be thoughtful as for the use case scenarios. And I think that as we think about reactor sizing, and that's where I'm going to put on my chemical/environmental engineering hat on. What's the HRT on this? What's the hydraulic retention time that we would need to drop down the PFAS? This is just PFOA, in DI water. And so as we start to work with more complicated matrices, we would expect some effect on the catalysis. And so I think there is a practical limitation in my mind anyway, is that we probably want to focus on photocatalysis for higher concentration wastewaters, for example. And that would be a way to develop this material, or more broadly, photocatalysis. The waters can't be too dark or too, how should I say, containing too much natural organic matter, because I think that will also absorb out the UVC and interfere with the light absorption properties. And so I think there's that balancing game that we do have to think about from some practical aspects.
I was thinking about exactly that when you were making your remarks. Leachates from landfills are a challenge for managing PFAS because they tend to be dark in color. They've got lots of organic matter because they've been in water moving through solid waste. So they might require some pretreatment, do you think, before you could perhaps destroy the PFOA or PFAS, different compounds?
No, I think that's. I think landfill leachate, I think, is an excellent direction to go, because that's an untapped wastewater source containing PFAS that I think is worth digging into more. I think through photocatalysis, and I say this for the following reason, that you probably don't want to use photocatalytic as a direct treatment of the leachate itself. I think you'd probably want to perhaps treat maybe the leachate post carbon filter. I think if you can clarify that water through a carbon bed, and then what comes off of that through that bed would be what? The shorter chain PFAS, some PFOA would break through. I think that's the type of water that could be a target, an excellent target for photocatalysis.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
Mm-hmm. All right. So maybe I might make a point about the boron nitride. One more thing, and then I'll show one more slide. Is that the other thing that makes the boron nitride, I think, uniquely more effective than TiO2 is that these defects allows the boron nitride, which is normally hydrophobic, but water suspendable. And so those defects allows the BN to be in contact with the water, and that allows the PFOA, which is a surfactant essentially, to be able to come into contact with that surface much more with a stronger affinity than, say, compared to TiO2, which is even more hydroxylated and has a less of an affinity to the TiO2. So I think that affinity to PFOA is higher on the BN than on the TiO2. We are measuring those things now through simple jar tests and to calculate and to quantify the adsorption isotherm, through adsorption isotherm measurements, the adsorption coefficients as an example. Okay.
Here's another question, Mike. This one from Sabrina Bradshaw. Does the boron nitride continue to remain effective as you add more PFOA? You've got an influent stream coming in, or does some chemical attrition occur? Do you have to recharge it?
Yeah, the answer is, based on everything we've seen, the boron nitride is very stable. We've done many tests, and I would say that the boron nitride is very robust. It is chemically stable. and that we do not have to recharge with the boron nitride powder. Now, having said that, the way we've been operating it has been under this batch mode of spiking in additional amounts of PFOA without having to centrifuge and recycle, but we do that. And I think the question perhaps would be, can this be implemented on a larger scale that could be done at scale? And so I would say yes, but probably not under the slurry format. We are exploring that slurry approach with a company that some of you might know as Purifics through the Newt Center. But one more practical way to consider is to attach boron nitride to a surface that would be in close proximity to a UV light source. And I think that would be a good direction to immobilize the BN, and you bring the wastewaters to the material.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes good sense. Here's another question, this one from Cedric Mott again. Have you evaluated how the rate coefficient or the reaction rate is affected by chain length, shorter chain versus longer chain PFAS? Is the reaction rate affected by the size of the molecule?
These are the exact same questions that we are knocking out and addressing now. And so we are doing these studies where we are looking at different length PFCAs or shorter chain versions of the PFOA. And what we're seeing, what it looks like, is that it seems to be matching up with our hypothesis that as the PFOA starts to get shorter, that the activity, the rate constant, starts to become smaller, meaning it starts to become less active for the shorter chain. And we correlate that to the shorter chain having a less affinity to the surface. The shorter the chain, the less surfactant like the molecule has in terms of a property. And I think that's why the shorter chain stuff, while it does degrade, it's slower.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense, right? Because it's got to associate, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm. So, I think that's, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Please continue.
Sure. I was going to say that before I show my last slide, is that, the shorter chain is something that is, and the people in the field of photocatalysis, but also any PFAS researcher looking to degrade and to destroy have to contend with the presence of short chain byproducts. In our system, it does degrade, but we want to figure out how to redesign our catalyst. And our catalysts at this point are boron nitride based, and we think we have some good leads on how to do that. But to make it more, I would say, attractive to the shorter chain version so that we can amp up the reactivities to at least as fast as the PFOA. And so wouldn't it be great if the half-life for the PFOA of 60 minutes can be shortened up? I've actually shortened it up to about 10 minutes now. But even 60 minutes is pretty good. But can we see that in the C7, C6s, C4s? We have some promising signs, but that book hasn't been written yet, let's put it this way.
What are the things you're thinking about for to scale this up to practical applications? And wonderful science here and really practical. The challenge always is in translation, right? How do we take our ideas from the research lab and get them out into the field? What do you see as next steps in that?
Yes, so I think one of the nice things about what we've done in our lab, our small contribution to the field so far, is to identify not just a material, but perhaps a different way of thinking about how to destroy PFAS. And that's really to look at the hydrophobic nature of materials to enhance the reactivity. So in terms of sort of translating that out there, and I think I would say this for all my colleagues working in this area, is that we want to find good partners who want to, kind of take it from a TRL1 level to a TRL4 level. And so the reactor approach would be a great way to implement this. And I would say perhaps using at a landfill treatment site, that'd be a good direction. Another direction I think would be something to consider what if we have waters that are contaminated with PFAS that don't necessarily need to be treated that quickly. Okay, so can we just use sunlight? Can we just use something simple? How simple can we get this thing to go? So that's sort of what I would call a de minimis way of thinking about how to make a practical approach of degrading PFAS. And so I want to show you one more slide that allowed us to kind of think through to answering this question. Would sunlight work with BN to decompose PFOA? By way of me talking about it, yeah, it's a leading question, but I'm excited to kind of share some results with everyone here. Here are our reactors, 3 water plastic bottles that contain 3 different catalysts. BN is in the middle, TiO2 is in the right-hand side, and then the third one is what I call BN-Y. It's on the left-hand side. Okay, Y is something that I use to modify the BN. I'll tell you what that is at the end, but we'll call it another material. And on a sunny day back in March, my team decided, let's go ahead and just see if it works. And it was sunny, cloudy, and here, yeah, my students are meteorologists now in my group. And these are the results. The answer is yes, it does work. Same plot, same way of looking at the data, and the TiO2 is at that blue line over the course of 4 hours did nothing to the PFOA concentration. The BN material, you can't see it, but it's in that dotted line up here, also does nothing to the PFOA concentration. Only for this BN-Y material did we see some activity, although it was slow at first. You can see the concentration of PFOA start to drop, and after 4 hours, maybe about 60%, or rather 40% has gone away, okay? And that's a good sign, but you need the full sign. Did we detect any fluoride ions? The answer is yes. In this simple experiment, there's no stir bar, by the way. These are just plastic bottles, and these are just powders in the water, air, using sunlight. There's no UVC light bulb. 24% of organofluorides have been released and were released after 4 hours. That, to me, was kind of, whoa, what's going on here? So that could be an interesting direction to go, especially for waters that don't need to be cleaned up that quickly, that would be in areas that don't have high-tech equipment. And maybe this is a direction that people can dig into. And that's something we're looking into. Okay.
Really neat. I like your reactor vessels, by the way.
It's very cheap.
Here's another question from Jeffrey Jang. He asked about if there's other dissolved species or other things in the water, how might that affect your reaction rates?
If there are other things in the water, the answer is it does affect, and it's really, I would say, co-contaminant dependent, and so and concentration dependent as well. We haven't done the full screening yet, but we've changed out the DI water matrix with simulated drinking water, and so the reaction does slow down, and I think to about 20 or 30% or so. We've tried waters with higher salt concentrations, and so we do see the expected lowering of the overall activity. If we start to spike in small amounts of humic acid, there's a small to negligible effects, but if we overload it, I forget the actual concentration numbers, then the material, then the humic acid knocks down the activity by over 50%. So these are things that we do watch out for, the contaminant type and the concentration. Okay.
Great, thanks.
So yeah, my pleasure. So I want to be mindful of my time and everyone's time here. So I will just flash 2 more slides if that's okay with Craig. Is that okay?
Please.
All right. So let's see here. There it is. So 2 more slides, and I'll just say that you know, for those interested in the details of the chemistry, here's some references here. And I think that's one thing that we really want to emphasize is that this is just for PFOA, and it's under idealized conditions, but we are very much aware of just how rich the PFAS environment is in terms of the diversity, in terms of compounds. And we think that looking in terms of hydrophobicity as a way to fine tune our catalyst can be a way to address certain subclasses of PFAS. Okay. And so this is my last slide, actually. And maybe with that, I'll just sort of end my comments here.
I got one more question for you, if we could do this one quickly. From Cedric Mott again. Have you tried aerating the reactor to evaluate the impact of kind of an air CO2 or air oxygen mix? And
we haven't. Yes. No, thank you for that question. We haven't actually performed an aeration experiment. We have air as the headspace, but we haven't performed an experiment where we could have a continuous aeration mode there. That could be an interesting to do. But that I would love to kind of maybe dig into that offline to see if there's some additional benefits that we might gain from that particular study. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, and Mike's available. If his email address is on the handouts, and he's easy to find at Rice. You can just Google him. If you got some follow-up questions, please reach out to him. I'm sure he'd be glad to talk with you. This has been wonderful, Mike, and for the audience as well. A lot of really good questions. I wanted to just add one remark from Renee Poink that she really was grateful for your thoughtful way of explaining why things work. And I really appreciated that too, Mike. Really thoughtful, clear discussion of mechanisms. So really appreciate that. And let's all thank Mike.
Fun for me. Fun for me.
It is fun, isn't it? And I think all of us have enjoyed it. Let's thank Mike, and I hope many of you, if not all of you, can join us for our next science session. Again, December 9th, same time, Thursday, December 9th. Great. Well, thanks, Mike. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.